The moment my daughter-in-law looked at me and shouted, "Get up and do something useful," something inside me finally cracked. I had spent years cooking their meals, cleaning their messes, and pretending not to notice the quiet disrespect growing inside my own home. But that morning, standing in the kitchen where I had built a lifetime of memories, I realized the cruelest betrayal was not the words she said. It was the silence of my own son, staring at his phone as if I did not exist. What they both believed was that I was weak, old, and invisible. What they never imagined was that I had the power to change everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Linda Carter. I am 67 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that a home was the safest place a person could ever have. The house where I live stands near the quiet shoreline of Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota, United States. It is a modest wooden house with pale blue siding, wide windows that face the water, and a small porch where the evening wind moves softly through the pine trees. To anyone passing by, it probably looks like just another lakeside home. But to me, it has always been something more. Every board, every nail, every flower growing beside the walkway carries a memory of the life my husband and I built together. My husband, Robert Carter, spent most of his life working as a mechanic in a repair shop in Minneapolis. His hands were always stained with oil, but he had the patience of a craftsman and the quiet pride of a man who believed in honest work. I worked as a nurse in a community hospital in Hennepin County, often taking night shifts because that was the only way we could save enough money. For nearly 30 years, we lived carefully, putting aside small amounts from every paycheck until we could finally buy the piece of land by the lake that Robert had admired since he was a young man. We built our home slowly. Some weekends, Robert repaired the roof while I painted the walls or planted flowers in the garden. Other times, we simply sat together on the unfinished porch and imagined how the place would look when it was finally done. The house was never perfect, but it was ours. When our son Daniel was a boy, he used to run down the hill toward the lake every morning during summer vacation. I still remember the sound of his laughter echoing across the water. 3 years ago, everything changed. Robert died suddenly from a heart attack while working in the garage behind the house. One moment he was fixing an engine, and the next moment he was gone. The silence that followed his death settled into every corner of the house. The kitchen felt too quiet during breakfast. The evenings stretched longer than they ever had before. Sometimes I would wake up at night and forget for a moment that I was alone. Daniel, my only child, visited often during the months after the funeral. He worked in information technology for a company in Minneapolis and lived there with his wife, Jessica Miller Carter. Daniel had always been gentle and thoughtful, but he also avoided conflict whenever possible. Even as a child, he preferred peace over arguments. About 6 months after Robert died, Daniel came to see me one Sunday afternoon. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and suggested that he and Jessica move into the house for a while. He said the apartment they rented in the city was expensive and that living together might help me feel less alone. I agreed almost immediately. The idea of having family in the house again felt comforting. At first, things seemed normal. Jessica complimented the view of the lake and spoke enthusiastically about the garden. We shared dinners together, and the house briefly felt alive again. But slowly, small changes began to appear. Jessica moved furniture without asking. She replaced curtains and rearranged cabinets. The changes seemed harmless, yet something about them unsettled me. One quiet morning, I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while sunlight shimmered across the water outside. Jessica entered the room quickly, scanning the counter and the floor with an impatient expression. Without greeting me warmly, she spoke sharply and said I should not sit around all morning. She insisted that I should get up and do something useful in the house. The words were simple, but the tone carried a weight I had never heard before. I remember looking at her in silence. For the first time since Daniel and Jessica moved in, a strange thought crossed my mind. I was sitting in the kitchen that Robert and I had built together, yet suddenly it felt as though I no longer belonged there. If you are still watching and this moment already made you curious about what is really happening inside this house, comment number 1 below, so I know you are here with me, because what I discovered next about my own family changed everything. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. After the morning, Jessica told me to get up and do something useful. I tried to convince myself that it had only been a bad moment. Families sometimes say things they regret. I told myself she had simply been stressed, maybe tired from work, maybe irritated by something that had nothing to do with me. I had lived long enough to know that people occasionally speak without thinking. Still, something about the way she said it stayed with me. The house did not change overnight. The same morning sunlight still spread across the lake outside the kitchen window, and the wind still moved quietly through the tall pines behind the backyard. Yet inside the house, the atmosphere slowly began to feel different. It was not one large event, but many small ones that slowly formed a pattern. Jessica started making more decisions about the house without asking me. One afternoon, I returned from a short walk by the lake and found the living room rearranged. The couch had been moved closer to the window. The reading lamp Robert had always used was placed in a corner, and several of my decorations had disappeared from the shelves. When I asked about it, Jessica simply said she thought the room looked more modern this way. She spoke as if she had every right to change things. At first, I did not object. I told myself it was only furniture, but then other things began to change as well. The kitchen cabinets were reorganized. My baking pans were placed in a lower cupboard that was harder for me to reach. The small wooden bowl Robert had carved many years ago was replaced with a decorative glass one that Jessica brought home from a store in Minneapolis. One evening, I noticed something that troubled me more than any rearranged furniture. A photograph of Robert that had always stood on the main shelf in the living room was gone. After searching quietly, I found it on a narrow table in the hallway near the stairs. It was not hidden exactly, but it was no longer in the place where people naturally saw it. Jessica also began speaking differently when her friends visited. She often invited coworkers from her marketing job in Minneapolis to spend weekends near the lake. When they arrived, she showed them around the property proudly. But when she introduced me, she described me in a way that made me uncomfortable. She explained that I lived there with her and Daniel, as though the house belonged to them. Daniel rarely corrected her. When moments like that happened, he usually looked down at his phone or walked into another room. I recognized the same habit he had as a boy. Daniel had always disliked arguments. Even when he was young, he would rather remain silent than challenge someone he loved. One evening after dinner, I walked quietly down the hallway to bring a blanket to the living room. As I passed the open doorway, I realized Jessica was on the telephone with her mother. I had no intention of listening, but her voice carried clearly through the quiet house. She was laughing while describing the property and the view of the lake. She said living there was perfect, and that the house was worth far more than people expected. Then her voice became slightly quieter, but still confident. She explained that eventually the house would belong to her and Daniel anyway. I stopped walking. Jessica continued speaking about the future, as if everything were already decided. She mentioned that Daniel only needed to help with a few practical details one day, certain paperwork that would make things easier when the time came. I quietly returned to my bedroom without making a sound. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I looked around the room Robert and I had shared for decades. I thought about the years we spent working long shifts, saving money, and slowly building the life that filled this house with memories. For the first time since Jessica moved in, a troubling question entered my mind. Perhaps the problem was not simply disrespect. Perhaps Jessica believed that my home already belonged to her. If you are still here, and you can already feel the tension building in this story, comment number 2 below to let me know you are following closely. What happened next was the first moment I realized something was seriously wrong. Now let's continue with chapter 3. In the weeks after I overheard Jessica speaking about the house, as though it already belonged to her, something inside me changed. I did not confront her immediately. Instead, I began watching more carefully. I noticed how she spoke about the property, how she made plans about rooms and furniture without ever including me in the conversation. Each small moment by itself might have seemed harmless, but together they formed a quiet pattern that I could no longer ignore. Late in May, Jessica announced that she wanted to host a barbecue gathering at the house. She explained that several of her coworkers from Minneapolis had never seen Lake Minnetonka and that our place would be perfect for a weekend get-together. She spoke with the confident enthusiasm of someone organizing an event in a home she believed she controlled. Daniel supported the idea and said it might be nice to have people around again. I did not object. Instead, I spent most of the following day preparing the house. Old habits are difficult to break. For decades, I had taken pride in keeping this home welcoming. I swept the patio beside the lake, arranged the outdoor chairs near the dock, and trimmed the rose bushes Robert had planted years earlier. Inside the kitchen, I prepared several dishes that were easy to serve outdoors. The work took most of the afternoon, but I told myself it was simply another gathering like the many Robert and I once hosted. By early evening, several cars pulled into the driveway. Jessica greeted her friends with excitement and immediately began showing them the yard. From the kitchen window, I could hear their admiration when they saw the lake and the long stretch of wooden dock extending into the water. The view had always impressed visitors, even when the house itself remained simple. Jessica led her guests through the living room and toward the back porch. I stepped outside to welcome them politely. When she introduced me, she said I was Daniel's mother who lived there with them. The words were casual, almost careless, yet they carried an implication that unsettled me deeply. I noticed one woman glance around the house with curiosity, as though trying to understand the arrangement. Throughout the evening, Jessica directed the gathering with increasing confidence. She asked me to bring trays of food and refill drinks while she continued entertaining her friends. I moved quietly between the kitchen and the patio, focusing on small tasks so I would not draw attention. Still, the feeling of being a guest in my own home grew stronger with each passing hour. The moment that stayed with me happened shortly before sunset. A few guests were standing near the railing that overlooked the lake. Jessica was describing how peaceful the property was and how lucky she and Daniel were to live there. Without thinking, I gently mentioned that Robert and I had built the house many years earlier. I did not say it with anger. I simply wanted the truth to exist in the conversation. Jessica turned toward me with visible irritation. In front of everyone, she raised her voice slightly and said I should stop correcting her and instead get up and do something useful. The words were sharp enough that several people fell silent. Daniel stood nearby holding a glass. He heard everything, yet he said nothing. For a moment, I felt the weight of every pair of eyes on me. Then I quietly returned to the kitchen and continued cleaning dishes that were already clean. Later, as the sky turned orange over the lake, I stepped outside alone and watched the water move in slow ripples against the dock. Standing there, I realized something important. Jessica was no longer hiding her disrespect, and Daniel was no longer protecting me from it. If you are still watching and wondering how far this situation will go, comment number 3 below so I know you are still with me. Because the next moment was when the truth started to reveal itself in ways I never expected. Let's continue with chapter 4. The morning after the barbecue felt unusually quiet. I woke early, long before Daniel or Jessica came downstairs. The house still carried the faint smell of grilled food and smoke from the evening before. Through the kitchen window, I could see the lake stretching out under a pale gray sky. The water looked calm, almost perfectly smooth, as though nothing had disturbed it the night before. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere felt different to me. I walked slowly through the kitchen, noticing the plates I had already washed and stacked the previous evening. The chairs outside on the patio were still slightly out of place from where the guest had moved them. Normally, I would have felt satisfaction after hosting a gathering. For many years, Robert and I had welcomed neighbors and friends into this home. Those evenings had always been full of laughter and warm conversation. But the memory of Jessica's voice still echoed in my mind. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table where Robert and I had shared breakfast for decades. As I watched the morning light move across the lake, I thought about everything that had happened over the past months. Jessica's small changes in the house, the way she spoke about the property to her friends, and Daniel's silence during the barbecue all began to form a single troubling picture. What disturbed me most was not the rearranged furniture or the sharp tone of Jessica's words. It was the growing sense that she believed the house already belonged to her and Daniel. The idea settled heavily in my thoughts as I sat alone in the quiet kitchen. Later that morning, Daniel left for work, and Jessica drove into the city shortly afterward. When the house finally became empty, I made a decision that had been forming quietly in my mind since the night before. Instead of confronting Jessica directly, I needed to speak with someone who understood both the law and the history of this house. That afternoon, I drove to see my old friend Margaret Thompson. Margaret had worked for many years as a lawyer in the county court system before retiring. We had known each other for decades, long enough that she remembered when Robert and I first purchased the land by the lake. Margaret welcomed me warmly into her home. The familiar smell of brewed tea and old books filled her living room, creating a calm space where I felt comfortable speaking openly. I explained everything that had happened since Daniel and Jessica moved into my house. I described the subtle changes Jessica made, the conversation I overheard about the property, and the way she spoke to me in front of her guests. Margaret listened quietly while I spoke. When I finished, she leaned back thoughtfully and reminded me of something simple but important. The house, she explained, was legally mine. As long as the property remained in my name, no one else had authority over it unless I agreed to transfer that control. Her words did not solve my problem immediately, but they gave me clarity. Margaret advised me to review my legal documents and make sure everything related to the house was current and properly recorded. She suggested I remain calm and observe the situation carefully before making any sudden decisions. When I drove back home later that afternoon, the lake looked peaceful again in the fading sunlight. Yet as I walked toward the front door, I realized something had changed within me. For the first time since Jessica moved in, I was no longer simply hoping the situation would improve. I was beginning to think about how to protect what Robert and I had spent a lifetime building. If you are still here, and this story is starting to surprise you, comment number 4 below and let me know you are still following the journey. What happened next pushed everything to a point where there was no turning back. Let's move into chapter 5. After speaking with Margaret, I returned home with a different state of mind. Nothing about the house had physically changed, yet I moved through the rooms with a sharper awareness. For months I had tried to ignore Jessica's behavior and convince myself that the tension inside the house was temporary. Now I understood that hoping for improvement was not enough. I needed to observe what was really happening. During the following days, I began paying attention to details that once seemed unimportant. Jessica spent long stretches of time sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. She often spoke on the telephone while scrolling through documents on the screen. Her conversations frequently mentioned property values, taxes, and renovations. I could not hear every word clearly, but the topics were familiar enough to trouble me. Daniel continued his usual routine, leaving early in the morning for his job in Minneapolis and returning late in the evening. When he came home, he seemed tired and distracted. If Jessica discussed plans for the house, he usually nodded without asking many questions. Watching them together, I often wondered how much Daniel truly understood about the direction Jessica was pushing things. One quiet afternoon, both of them left the house to run errands in the city. The silence after their car disappeared down the driveway felt unusually heavy. I spent some time cleaning the kitchen before moving into the small study Daniel sometimes used as a workspace. The room faced the lake and held a simple desk, a chair, and a narrow bookshelf. I intended only to dust the surface and straighten a few papers. While I was wiping the desk, I noticed that one of the drawers had been left slightly open. Inside, I could see the edge of a large envelope. At first, I hesitated. Looking through my son's belongings felt wrong. I stood there for several moments, debating whether I should simply close the drawer and walk away. But Margaret's voice echoed in my thoughts. She had reminded me that protecting the house meant understanding what was happening around me. Slowly, I pulled the drawer open and removed the envelope. Inside were several printed pages clipped neatly together. At the top of the first page, I saw a title that immediately tightened the muscles in my chest. The document was a power of attorney. I had encountered similar paperwork many times during my years working as a nurse when families arranged financial authority for aging relatives. I began reading carefully. The language was formal and filled with legal terms, but the meaning became clear within minutes. The document granted decision-making authority regarding financial and personal matters if certain circumstances occurred. The signature authorizing the document belonged to Daniel. The person granted authority was Jessica. My hands trembled slightly as I continued reading. The document did not transfer ownership of the house directly, yet it allowed Jessica to act on Daniel's behalf in matters concerning my financial affairs if I were ever considered unable to manage them myself. In practical terms, it could place my property within her reach if my health were questioned. For a long moment, I stood in the quiet study holding the papers. My first feeling was disbelief. I wondered if Daniel understood what he had signed, or if Jessica had convinced him it was simply routine paperwork. Either possibility hurt more than I expected. I placed the documents back into the envelope exactly as I had found them and returned the drawer to its original position. When I stepped outside onto the porch, the lake looked calm and unchanged under the afternoon sunlight. Yet I knew something important had shifted. Jessica was not merely assuming the house would one day belong to her. She had already begun preparing for it. After I returned the envelope to Daniel's desk drawer, I stepped outside onto the back porch and sat in the wooden chair Robert had built years ago. From there, I could see the lake stretching across the horizon. The water moved slowly in small ripples as the afternoon sun reflected across its surface. It was the same peaceful view I had watched almost every day for decades. Yet that afternoon, it felt strangely distant, as if the quiet beauty of the lake belonged to another life. The document I had just read stayed in my thoughts with unsettling clarity. I had seen many legal forms during my years as a nurse when families arranged financial authority for elderly relatives. A power of attorney could be harmless when everyone understood its purpose, but the document in Daniel's desk had been prepared without my knowledge. That detail alone made it impossible to ignore. What troubled me most was the uncertainty surrounding Daniel's role in it. I did not know whether he had signed the document after carefully reading it, or whether Jessica had simply presented it to him as routine paperwork. Daniel had always trusted people easily, especially the woman he married. The possibility that he might have signed something serious without understanding it seemed painfully believable. I sat on the porch for a long time that afternoon, remembering the years when Daniel was a boy running along the shoreline with his small fishing net. Robert used to stand beside me on this very porch and laugh when Daniel slipped on the wet grass near the dock. Those memories made the situation feel even more complicated. I did not want to believe that my own son would knowingly take part in something that could threaten my independence. The following morning, I decided to visit Margaret again. I did not bring the document itself because I had returned it to Daniel's desk exactly where I found it. Instead, I wrote down the details I remembered. Margaret listened carefully as I described the document and the authority it granted Jessica. Her expression became thoughtful as she considered the situation. She explained that a power of attorney was not unusual by itself. Families sometimes prepared such documents in advance in case illness or injury made decision-making difficult. The problem, she said, was the way this document had appeared without any conversation involving me. Margaret advised me to remain calm and gather more information before confronting anyone in the house. Acting too quickly could create confusion and allow Jessica to adjust her plans. She suggested that I review my own legal paperwork and ensure that my will and property records were current and clearly documented. Driving back toward the lake that afternoon, I felt a quiet determination settling in my mind. The situation was no longer simply about harsh words or uncomfortable family dynamics. Someone had begun taking legal steps that could affect my future. When I arrived home, the house looked peaceful in the fading afternoon light. Jessica was in the kitchen preparing dinner while Daniel sat in the living room scrolling through his phone. Everything appeared ordinary on the surface. Yet, as I walked through the familiar rooms, I realized that my perspective had changed. Jessica believed she had already begun securing control over my life. What she did not realize was that I had begun preparing my own response. If you are still watching and you want to see how this confrontation changes everything, comment number 6 below so I know you made it this far, because what happened after this moment completely shifted the direction of the story. Now, let's go to chapter 7. The days after my second visit with Margaret passed quietly on the surface. Life inside the house followed the same routine it always had. Daniel left early each morning for his job in Minneapolis, and Jessica spent much of her time moving between the kitchen, the living room, and her laptop at the dining table. From the outside, nothing looked unusual, yet I moved through those days with a sharper awareness than before. Once a person begins noticing patterns, it becomes difficult to ignore them again. Jessica spoke about the house more confidently than ever. She mentioned improvements to the kitchen cabinets and talked about replacing the wooden railing along the lakeside deck. Her voice carried the tone of someone planning a future she believed was already hers. Each time she spoke that way, I remained silent, observing rather than responding. Daniel rarely questioned her ideas. When she discussed renovations or financial decisions, he usually nodded while scrolling through his phone or sipping his evening coffee. I watched those moments carefully, wondering whether he remembered the document he had signed or if he believed it was merely routine paperwork. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail that confirmed my fears more clearly than anything else. The envelope came from a legal office in Minneapolis. I opened it at the kitchen table while Jessica was upstairs on a phone call. The document inside referred to administrative records connected to family financial authorization. The language was formal and complicated, but the meaning was unmistakable. The paperwork acknowledged the existence of legal authority arrangements related to personal affairs and property oversight. The letter did not transfer control of the house. It did not mention Jessica directly, yet it confirmed that the legal process she had started had already entered official records somewhere beyond the walls of my home. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. For several minutes, I sat at the table staring at the lake through the kitchen window. The calm water reflected the late afternoon sunlight exactly as it had for decades. Yet the sense of peace that view once brought me now carried a different feeling. Later that evening, Jessica spoke with Daniel about long-term plans for the house. I could hear them from the living room while I organized a few books on the nearby shelf. Jessica explained that certain responsibilities would be easier to manage sooner rather than later. She spoke about financial matters and the confident tone she often used when presenting ideas she expected Daniel to accept. Daniel responded quietly, his voice uncertain. He did not challenge her explanation, but he also did not sound completely convinced. Listening to them, I realized something that complicated my emotions even further. Daniel might not fully understand the consequences of what he had signed. As night approached, I walked down to the edge of the lake and stood beside the old wooden dock Robert had built so many years ago. The water moved gently against the posts, while the sky faded into shades of orange and blue. Jessica believed she had begun securing control over my life step by step. What she did not know was that I had already started preparing my own protection. And when the time came, the consequences of her actions would not unfold the way she expected. The letter from the legal office remained in my thoughts long after I folded it back into its envelope. In the days that followed, life inside the house continued in the same outward rhythm. Jessica spoke about plans for the kitchen and the lakeside deck as if the future had already been decided. Daniel continued moving between work and home with the quiet distraction that had become his habit. To anyone watching from outside, our household might have appeared peaceful. Inside my mind, however, something had changed permanently. One afternoon, while Jessica was in the city and Daniel was at work, I walked into my bedroom and opened the wooden cabinet Robert had always used to store our financial records. The cabinet had been standing against the wall for years, and inside it rested the documents that told the story of our life together. I pulled the folders out one by one and spread them across the bed. There were old mortgage papers from the first years we owned the property. There were tax records showing the gradual increase in the land value as the area around Lake Minnetonka grew more desirable. There were insurance forms, receipts from repairs, and handwritten notes Robert had once made about improvements to the house. Sorting through those papers felt like opening a quiet history of our life. I remembered the evenings when Robert and I sat at the kitchen table, calculating how much money we could save each month. I remembered the day we finally finished paying the last portion of the loan for the land. Every document in that cabinet carried a small piece of those memories. As I organized the records, I began separating the most important documents from the rest. The property deed remained the most significant paper among them. It clearly stated that the house and the land belonged to me. Seeing those words printed so plainly on the page gave me a sense of reassurance I had not felt in weeks. The next morning, I drove to Margaret's home again, bringing the letter from the legal office and the documents I had gathered. Margaret examined each page slowly and carefully. She explained that updating my records would strengthen my legal position and make it more difficult for anyone to claim authority over the property without my clear approval. She also introduced me to a younger attorney who specialized in property law. The attorney explained the steps required to confirm that all records regarding the house were properly documented. Updating a will and verifying the ownership details would create a clear legal foundation that could not easily be challenged. Driving back to the lake later that afternoon, I felt a calm determination replacing the uncertainty that had filled my thoughts before. Jessica believed she had already begun securing control over my future. Her confidence came from the assumption that I remained unaware of the steps she had taken. Back at the house, Jessica was once again speaking enthusiastically about possible improvements to the kitchen. I listened quietly without interrupting. She did not notice the folder resting inside my bag. That folder now contained the first pieces of my own preparation. Jessica believed she was quietly arranging the future of this house. What she did not understand was that I had begun quietly protecting it. If you are still here and you want to see how this entire story finally ends, comment number 8 below and stay with me. The final part of this journey reveals the outcome no one expected. Now, let's move toward the conclusion of the story. Several days passed after I finished organizing my legal documents. During that time, I did not mention anything to Jessica or Daniel about the steps I had taken. Life in the house continued with the same familiar routine. Jessica talked enthusiastically about renovation ideas, sometimes mentioning how the kitchen could be expanded or how the deck might be rebuilt to face the lake more directly. Daniel usually listened while nodding politely, rarely questioning the plan she described. I watched these conversations quietly, noticing how naturally Jessica spoke about the future of the house. Her confidence suggested she believed the path ahead was already clear. For a long time, I had allowed that assumption to grow unchecked. Now I understood that remaining silent had only encouraged it. One evening, Daniel returned from work earlier than usual. The late afternoon sunlight filled the living room, while the lake outside reflected a soft golden light. Jessica was standing near the kitchen counter, explaining another idea for changing the cabinets and moving several walls. Her voice carried the same certainty I had heard many times before. As I listened, I realized that the moment I had been preparing for had finally arrived. I walked slowly into the room and sat at the table. My voice remained calm when I spoke. I explained that during the past weeks, I had been reviewing my financial and property records. I mentioned that while organizing the paperwork, I became aware of documents connected to legal authority over personal matters. Without raising my voice, I asked Daniel if he remembered signing such a document. Daniel looked surprised. He paused before answering, clearly trying to recall the situation. He eventually explained that Jessica had once brought him some papers to sign. According to his memory, the documents were meant to help manage responsibilities in case something unexpected happened to my health. He said he believed the arrangement was simply a precaution. Jessica responded quickly, dismissing the concern and suggesting that planning ahead was responsible behavior. Her tone carried a trace of irritation, as though the discussion itself were unnecessary. I listened quietly before explaining that I had already spoken with legal advisors and updated my own records. The property deed, the will, and all related documents had been carefully reviewed and confirmed. The house remained fully under my authority, exactly as Robert and I had arranged many years earlier. The room grew noticeably still after I said those words. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to quiet realization. He seemed to understand that the paperwork he had signed might have created complications he never intended. For several moments, he looked between Jessica and me, clearly weighing the situation. Jessica's confidence faded slightly. Although she tried to continue speaking about practical planning, it was obvious she now understood something important had changed. The balance inside the house had shifted. I did not argue further that evening. Instead, I simply explained that decisions about the future of the property would remain mine while I was alive. The house represented decades of work shared with Robert, and its future would be determined carefully and deliberately. Later that night, I stood on the porch overlooking the lake as the last light faded across the water. The conversation had not been dramatic, yet it had revealed the truth more clearly than before. Jessica now knew that I was no longer unaware, and she understood that the house she believed she was quietly claiming would not be taken so easily. Time has a quiet way of revealing what truly matters. In the weeks after the conversation in the living room, the atmosphere inside the house changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. There were no loud arguments and no sudden departures. Yet the confidence that once surrounded Jessica's plans slowly faded. Jessica spoke less about renovations and long-term ideas for the property. The conversations about redesigning the kitchen or expanding the lakeside deck disappeared from daily discussion. When she moved through the house, Her tone carried less certainty than before. I could see that she understood the situation had shifted in a direction she had not expected. Daniel also seemed different. After learning how serious the legal document could have been, he became quieter and more thoughtful. For several days, he avoided speaking about the subject altogether. I could sense that he was struggling with the realization that his signature had nearly created a situation neither of us fully intended. One evening, he came home from work earlier than usual and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of old photographs spread across the surface. They were pictures Robert and I had taken during the early years of building the house. Some showed the empty land before the walls were raised. Others showed Daniel as a small boy standing proudly beside the unfinished porch. Daniel looked at the photographs for a long moment. He studied the images quietly, as if he were seeing that history for the first time with new understanding. The years of effort behind the house became visible in a way that numbers on a property document never could. After that evening, he began spending more time with me in small conversations about the past. Sometimes we talked about Robert and the way he repaired engines late into the night while saving money for the land. Other times we discussed the summers when Daniel learned to fish from the wooden dock beside the lake. Those conversations did not erase the tension that had developed in our household, but they created a new honesty between us. Jessica remained distant during that period. The certainty she once carried about the future of the house had been replaced with a cautious silence. Whether she felt anger or disappointment, she kept those emotions largely to herself. The plans she once spoke about so freely had disappeared. For me, the change was quieter, but more meaningful. At the beginning of this story, I had allowed fear of conflict to keep me silent. I worried that speaking openly might damage the fragile peace inside the family. Yet that silence had allowed misunderstandings and assumptions to grow until they threatened the life Robert and I had built together. Standing on the porch one evening, I watched the sun slowly sink behind the trees across the lake. The water reflected a wide path of orange light stretching toward the dock. It was the same view Robert and I had admired for so many years. The house remained exactly where it had always been, strong and steady beside the shoreline. But my relationship with it had changed. It no longer represented only the memories of the past. It also represented the moment I finally understood that protecting what you have built sometimes requires quiet courage. And sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear from their own life. Sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with anger or loud words, but with quiet strength. Life has a way of testing our dignity through the people closest to us, and those moments reveal who we truly are. When respect disappears and silence becomes easier than speaking the truth, many people slowly begin to feel invisible in their own lives. Yet dignity has a powerful voice waiting beneath that silence. The moment someone decides to stand up for what they built, what they sacrificed for, and what they deserve, everything begins to change. Homes are not only walls and roofs. They carry the years of effort, love, and perseverance that created them. Protecting those things is not selfish. It is honoring the life that made them possible. If this story meant something to you, thank you for spending your time here. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to follow more meaningful stories like this.